The distress beacon from the frontier colony of Vega Prime hit Admiral Carol Haynes's command deck at 0300 hours, and she was already moving before the second ping finished echoing through these, two of them capital class. The colony had 4,000 civilians and a single orbital defense platform that the Vega garrison commander described in his final transmission as, quote, a glorified tin can with attitude. Carol did not sit down. She stood at the center of the bridge of the UES Resolute and looked at her crew and said, "Get me a firing solution on all 14, and get me one that lets the colony keep its atmosphere when we are done." Her crew did not ask if she was serious. That was the thing about Carol Haynes. Nobody ever asked if she was serious. The Galactic Council had been watching humanity for 60 years, the kind that involved dedicated observation posts and committees with long names and heated debates about whether Earth species were, quote, developmentally stable enough for full council. Unofficially, the older races had been watching humans since the first Terran probe crossed the heliopause and the Keth intercepted it and found, pressed inside its golden record like a pressed flower from a very strange garden, the sound of a woman laughing. The Keth had brought it to the council floor and played it. The chamber had gone silent, not because the sound was threatening. It was warm and open and utterly without strategy. The Keth elder had said, "This species shares joy with the void," and the council had spent 3 sessions arguing about what that meant. 60 years later, they were still arguing. The Dominari had the longest institutional memory of any council species. They had watched empires form and collapse the way humans watched seasons change. And they had developed very specific opinions about which patterns preceded which disasters. When the Dominari observer on board the council watch post above Vega Prime saw the Resolute drop out of faster-than-light travel directly into the middle of the Jocketh formation, he sent an emergency alert to the council that read, simply, "The humans have done something." A methodical being named Vel, from a species that communicated primarily through pressure wave pulses, received the alert and convened an emergency session within 20 minutes. This was the fastest convening in council history, beating the previous record held by the incident where humanity had accidentally broadcast a planet-wide sporting event across 6 frequencies reserved for diplomatic communication, and a dozen species had shown up believing Earth was signaling mass surrender. Carol Haynes did not know any of this was happening above her. The Jocketh were not a kind species. They were efficient, which in their culture was the highest possible compliment. And their efficiency extended to the acquisition of resources, the suppression of weaker civilizations, and the very precise application of force to achieve political outcomes. They had 14 ships at Vega Prime because the colony sat on a deposit of lattice crystalline, ore that could reduce drive core construction time by 40%. The math was simple. The colony was inconvenient. The ore was valuable. They had not expected Carol Haynes. Admiral Haynes brought 4 ships, the Resolute, the UES Carthage, the UES Meridian, and a ship that technically should not have been there at all. A prototype vessel called the UES Galloway that was 3 weeks out of its final shakedown trial, and crewed by people who had not yet been issued their permanent assignment patches. The Galloway's captain, a 31-year-old named Kevin Park, had been eating a sandwich when the distress call came in and had redirected his ship before. Kevin had left the sandwich on the console. He would not get back to it for 11 hours. The Jocketh Formation Commander, whose designation translated roughly to Fleet Efficiency Prime, registered the 4 human ships entering sensor range and performed a rapid calculation. The humans had 1 capital ship to the Jocketh's 2. The calculation was not complicated. The outcome was not in question. Fleet-Efficiency-Prime opened a hailing frequency, prepared to offer the humans a negotiated withdrawal, which was efficient and would allow both parties to exit the engagement without resource. Carol Haynes did not answer the hail. She was talking to Kevin Park. What she said to him, in the 40 seconds before she opened fire, was this: "You are going to take the Galloway directly into the gap between their 2 capital ships, and you are going to make them look at you." Kevin Park said, "Yes, ma'am." He did not say how. Carol did not ask. She had read his file. There was a reason she had redirected to his position when the call came in. The Galloway went in. The Jaketh capital ships did look. Every targeting system, every point defense array, every tactical officer on both vessels fixed on the small, fast human prototype running directly into the kill zone like it had somewhere important to be. Carol hit them from behind with everything the Resolute and the Carthage had. The Meridian took the orbital defense platform offline for 11 seconds, patched its targeting system directly into the Meridian's own fire control network, brought it back online, and suddenly the tin can with attitude was firing with the precision of a full warship. 4 minutes and 30 seconds after the engagement began, Fleet Efficiency Prime sent a priority distress signal to Jaketh High Command. The signal read, in translation, "We require clarification on human tactical doctrine. We are also on fire." The council chamber received the transmission secondhand, through the Dominari Observer's relay. Vel played it for the assembled delegates, and then sat very still, in the way Vel's species indicated the processing of unexpected information. The human representative to the council, a career diplomat named Gary Owens, who had been woken up for the emergency session and was still, holding a cup of coffee, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "We are going to need to update our fleet assessment on file, aren't we?" It was not a question. On the bridge of the Resolute, Carol Haynes finally sat down. The colony was intact. The ore deposit was intact. Kevin Park's sandwich was not intact, because in the violence of the Galloway's evasive maneuvers, it had slid off the console and hit. Kevin reported this to Carol at the end of the engagement debrief. It was the only casualty of the Battle of Vega Prime. Carol told him to put in for a replacement through the standard requisition process. Above them, on 14 Jaketh ships that were no longer in formation, the crews were having a very different kind of conversation. And in the council chamber, a session that had been called to discuss a potential diplomatic incident was becoming something. The Dominari Observer's second transmission arrived 20 minutes after the first. It said, "We require a full committee. The humans have done several things." Gary Owens had been Humanities Council representative for 9 years. He had the specific kind of patience that grows in people who spend their careers explaining one civilization to 12 others, a patience that was less about calm and more about knowing which battles were worth having before. He set his coffee down on the council chamber's human spec table, which the Secretariat had installed after the third session, where Gary had balanced it on his knee and looked at the 12 species represented in the chamber. The Jaketh seat was empty. The Jaketh had not missed a session in 40 years. Delegate Sora of the Velari, who communicated through a translation collar and had the posture of something that had been standing in the same place for a geological era, spoke first. She said, "The human fleet engaged a Jaketh formation of superior force and achieved a decisive outcome in under 5 minutes. We would like to understand the mechanism." Gary said, "Which part?" Sora said, "All of it." That was the thing Gary had learned about council sessions. The other species were not stupid. They were not uninformed. They had the same data he had. What they wanted from him was context, the texture of human decision-making that the raw tactical reports did not capture. They wanted to understand why Admiral Haynes had not responded to the hail, why she had sent a prototype ship directly into the enemy formation, why the outcome had been what it was when the numbers suggested it shouldn't have been. Gary said, "Give me a moment." He pulled up the engagement record on his personal screen and watched it again from the top. He had watched it 4 times already. He kept watching it for the same reason he suspected the Dominari Observer had already sent it to. His home command 6 times. It was the 11 seconds where the Meridian went dark that he kept stopping on. 11 seconds was not a long time. It was long enough to take a weapons platform offline, rewrite its targeting architecture, and bring it back online as a networked asset. The Jaketh hadn't accounted for it because it wasn't in any tactical doctrine on file. You didn't take your own asset offline in the middle of an engagement. The risk was not acceptable. The Meridian's captain, a woman named Dana Ruiz, had apparently decided the risk was acceptable. Gary said, "The mechanism is that our people have a very specific relationship with acceptable risk." The Velhari delegate processed this through her translation collar. Gary said, "We calculate risk the same way everyone does, but we weight the alternatives differently. Specifically, we weight the option of doing nothing as carrying its own cost. one that we include in the calculation. Most species treat inaction as the default, the thing you return to when the risk is too high. We don't do that. Inaction has a price tag for us, and sometimes that price tag is higher than the risk of the thing that seems impossible. The chamber was quiet in the specific way it got quiet when Gary said something that was going to be discussed in 12 separate home systems before the next session. Admiral Carol Haynes was not in the chamber. She was still at Vega Prime, overseeing the restoration of the colony's orbital systems and submitting a 40-page after-action report that her adjutant had described as thorough and her fleet command superior had described as brutal. Carol did not write reports to be kind to herself. She wrote them to be useful to the next person who faced a version of the same situation. Page 11 of the report read, "In total, the Galloway performed beyond all projected capability metrics. Captain Park's instinct for threat vector manipulation was exceptional. Recommend for immediate. Also recommend the Galloway sandwich storage be bolted down." Her adjutant had flagged the last sentence as possibly inappropriate for an official document. Carol had kept it on the Jacqueth command vessel, which was now 3 days' travel from Vega Prime and moving with the particular speed of ships that are not fleeing but are also not stopping. Fleet Efficiency Prime was composing his own report. The Jacqueth did not do after-action reports the way humans did. They did efficiency assessments. He was supposed to be assessing what had gone wrong and what adjustments were required. He kept getting stuck on the 11 seconds, not because the tactic itself was unfamiliar. Creative networking of orbital assets was documented in Council tactical archives going back to. It was the timing, the willingness to go dark in the middle of an active engagement. Every efficiency model he ran said the cost was too high. The window of vulnerability was too wide. Any competent opposing force would have struck in those 11 seconds. Carol Haynes had not struck in those 11 seconds. She had used those 11 seconds to finish repositioning the Carthage for the second wave. Fleet-Efficiency-Prime had run the simulation 40 times. In every run, the human admiral had the opportunity to strike the meridian during its offline window and chose not to. In every run, the reason she did not was that she was already moving to the next phase of an engagement she had apparently planned through to its conclusion before firing a single shot. He wrote in his report, "The human fleet did not improvise. They executed a plan that assumed success at every stage before success was confirmed. This is not tactically sound." He sat with that sentence for a long time. In the council chamber, the session had moved into its third hour. The issue of the Jacqueth's empty seat had been raised formally. The issue of Vega Prime's colony status had been raised and resolved. The colonists were fine. Their ore deposit was fine. The only damage to the surface was a secondary fire in a storage structure caused by debris, and the issue that kept pulling the session back, the one that Vel kept returning to with the careful patience of someone who had identified the actual problem in the room, was simpler. Vel said it directly. Because Vel's species had not evolved around social indirection and found it inefficient in the way the Jacqueth found risk inefficient. Vel said, "The human fleet assessment on council record lists humanity as a mid-tier defensive power with limited offensive projection capability. This assessment was compiled 18 months ago. Based on the Vega Prime engagement, this assessment is wrong. We need to know by how much." Gary Owens picked up his coffee. He drank it anyway. He said, "I can get you updated numbers." Vel said, "How long?" Gary said, "I'll have something to you by end of week." Vel said, "This was a single fleet engagement. How many fleets does humanity currently operate?" Gary looked at Vel for a moment. Then he looked at the rest of the chamber. The question was reasonable. It was the question anyone would ask. It was also the question Gary had been waiting for since the session started, because the answer was going to change the temperature of the room in ways he had been quietly preparing for since he watched the engagement record the first time. He said, "I'll include that in the numbers I send you." Sora said, "Give us an estimate now." Gary said, "I'd rather give you accurate numbers than a fast estimate," the Dominari observer said. From his seated position at the back of the chamber where observers sat, he said very quietly, "The estimate is the point, Representative Owens. The estimate tells us whether this was an anomaly." Gary set down his cold coffee. He said, "It wasn't an anomaly." The chamber stayed very quiet. Kevin Park, at that exact moment, was being handed a new sandwich by his ship's cook, who had heard about the original sandwich and taken it as a personal affront to the galleys. Kevin accepted it, took a bite, and went back to reading the promotion recommendation that Carol Haynes had apparently filed for him before the after-action report was even submitted. The recommendation was 4 sentences long. The last sentence read, "Do not waste this one." Kevin Park read it 3 times. Then he finished his sandwich and went back to the bridge. The updated fleet assessment that Gary Owens delivered to the Galactic Council was not a document. It was a data package. The distinction mattered because a document could be summarized and the summary could circulate through the Council's administrative channels and be discussed in the way documents were. Discussed with analysis and counter-analysis and the careful diplomacy of species who had been talking to each other for centuries. A data package could not be summarized. It had to be read. And when 12 alien species read it across a single 72-hour window, the Council's communication infrastructure registered a volume of internal messaging that exceeded the previous record by a factor of 3. The previous record had been set during the announcement of first contact with humanity. Gary had handed it to Vel in person and said, "I would recommend reading this somewhere quiet." Vel had read it in the Council library, which was as quiet as anything in the station got, and had sent Gary a 1-line message after. The message said, "When did this happen?" Gary had replied, "Gradually, and then all at once." The data package contained, among other things, the total number of active human fleet formations currently operating beyond Earth's solar system. It contained capability assessments for each formation. It contained the development timeline for the Galloway-class prototype that Kevin Park had taken into the Vega engagement, including the projected rollout schedule for 14 more vessels of the same class. It contained a section on human tactical doctrine that had been written by a researcher named Lou Brennan at the Earth Strategic Institute, a soft-spoken man who had spent 12 years studying how humans made decisions under pressure, and that section contained a paragraph that the Dominari Observer read 4 times and then forwarded to Dominari High Command with the subject line, "Read this before our next session. Human tactical creativity under constraint is not a cultural artifact or an expression of. It is a trained response to a specific institutional belief, which is that the mission outcome takes priority over the method. Human command structures do not penalize failure to follow prescribed doctrine when deviation from doctrine achieves the objective. They penalize failure to achieve the objective. This produces a force that, under pressure, treats its own tactical playbook as a starting suggestion rather than a fixed instruction set. The practical consequence is that human forces become harder to predict in direct proportion to the difficulty of the situation they face." The Dominari Observer had highlighted the last sentence. On the Resolute, Carol Haynes was dealing with a different kind of problem. Her ship's drive core had sustained a hairline stress fracture during the Vega engagement, the kind that didn't show up in post-engagement diagnostics and only revealed itself when the chief engineer ran the secondary calibration sweep that most engineers skipped because it took. Carol's chief engineer, a meticulous man named Walt Gideon, never skipped it. Carol was sitting in the engineering bay, watching Walt explain the fracture's location on a 3-dimensional schematic when the communication from Fleet Command came in. The message was brief. It said, "Admiral Haynes, the Council has requested your presence at the station for a formal briefing. This is not a request we were prepared to receive. Please advise on your availability." Carol looked at the schematic. She looked at Walt. She said how long to fix it. Walt said, 40 hours if we do it right, 20 if we cut corners. Carol said, "Do it right." Then she sent a reply to Fleet Command that said, "Available in 50 hours, bringing my after-action report in person." The Council had not, in 60 years of human membership, ever requested the physical presence of a human military officer for a formal briefing. They had requested representatives, diplomats, researchers, a poet once, under circumstances that had never been fully explained in the public record. They had never asked for an admiral. Gary Owens met Carol at the docking bay. When the Resolute arrived at Council Station, he had a fresh cup of coffee in each hand and gave her one without asking if she wanted it. She took it without thanking him. Gary said. "They're going to ask you about your decision to not respond to the Jacques hail." Carol said, "I know." Gary said, "The official position, if you want it, is that communications interference from the engagement pre-positioning made the hail inaudible." Carol said, "That's not true." Carol said, "So I won't say it." Carol walked 2 more steps and then stopped as well without turning around. Gary said, "Admiral, these are 12 species who have been running this council for 300. They have a very specific idea of how conflicts get resolved, and hails are part of that. Not answering a hail is, in council diplomatic terms, a significant statement." She said, "I know what it is in council terms. In tactical terms, it was the 4 seconds I needed to confirm the formation gap the Galloway was." Gary looked at her. He said, "That's what you're going to tell them?" Carol said, "That's what happened." Gary started walking again. "I'll be in the room. If things go sideways, look at me and I'll find a way to redirect." She didn't look at him once during the briefing. The council chamber had 12 species in it when Carol Haynes walked through the door in her duty uniform, which was not the dress Uniform Fleet Command had recommended and which she had left. Hanging in her cabin on the Resolute, she had read the recommendation and decided that the council deserved to see what a working admiral looked like after 50 hours of engine repair supervision. Sora of the Velhari spoke first. She said, "Admiral Haynes, we have reviewed the engagement record from Vega Prime." Carol said, "I have answers." Sora said, "Why did you not respond to the Jacques hail?" Carol said, "I was busy. The chamber absorbed this." Carol said, "I had a crew executing a maneuver that required precise timing. The hail was received. Responding to it was not the highest priority action available to me in that window." The Dominari observer leaned forward from the back of the chamber. He said, "You were aware you were declining a formal diplomatic contact under council protocol." Carol said, "I was aware." Carol said, "And 14 ships were threatening 4,000 civilians. The protocol could wait." She said it the way someone states a fact about weather. Not with heat, not with apology, just with the plain flatness of something she had already decided was true before she walked into. The chamber was quiet for a very long time. Then the Dominari observer said, "The Jacques have submitted a formal grievance over the engagement. They describe your actions as unprovoked aggression." Carol said, "The colony submitted a distress call." He said, "The Jacques contest the nature of the colony's status under council resource access." Carol said, "I know. Gary sent me the briefing documents. I read them on the way over. The Jacques argument depends on a provision interpretation that has not been tested in council. Courts, and if they want to test it, they are welcome to do that. While they are doing that, the 4,000 colonists at Vega Prime are still alive. So we have time." Nobody in the chamber said anything. Carol said, "Are there more questions?" There were more questions. They went on for 2 hours. Carol answered every one of them the same way she had answered the first, directly, in plain language, without diplomatic wrapping, and with the specific lack of apology that comes not from arrogance, but from people who have done the calculation and are at peace with the result. Gary Owens watched from his seat and drank his 3rd coffee of the day and did not have to. When it was over, when the council session had closed and the chamber had cleared, Veal approached Carol in the corridor outside and said, "One more question, not for the record." Carol said, "Go ahead." Vel said, "When you sent the Galloway into the formation gap, did you know it would work?" Carol said, "I knew, Kevin Park." Vel processed this for a moment. Then Vel said, "This is a very human answer." She finished her coffee and went to find Gary so she could get back to her ship. The Jacques did not submit their formal grievance to the council courts. This was noted by every species on the council, because the Jacques had never withdrawn a formal position in their history of council membership. They announced, through their diplomatic channel, that they were choosing to resolve the Vega Prime matter through internal review rather than. The council secretary, Vel, recorded this in the official minutes as a procedural withdrawal and made no comment. In the hallways outside the council chamber, 12 diplomatic staff from 12 different species spent the next 3 days making comments about very little else. The Velhari ambassador sent a personal message to her home government that was later, years afterward, included in a historical archive of documents from the period. The message said, "The Jacques pulled back. I have watched this council for 30 years, and I have never seen the Jaqueth pull back from. I do not think we have been correctly understanding what humanity is. The Velhari home government's response to this message was practical. They requested an update on the status of Velhari human diplomatic relations and asked whether existing agreements should be. The Velhari ambassador replied that the existing agreements were fine and that what needed reviewing was the Velhari military's assessment of human capability, which she suspected was similarly out of date. Kevin Park received his promotion at a ceremony on the Resolute that lasted 11 minutes because Carol Haynes believed in efficiency and because the crew had a repair schedule to get back to. Gary Owens attended via video link from the council station. He had not been invited. He showed up anyway. In the specific way, diplomats learn to show up to things that matter without being asked. Kevin accepted the promotion and shook Carol's hand and said, "Mom, I have a question." Carol said, "Go ahead." Kevin said, "When you told me to make them look at me, how did you know I'd figure out how to do that?" Carol said, "I read your file." She didn't say anything else. He nodded and went back to his post. The thing in Kevin's file that Carol had read was not exceptional by any single measure. It was a training simulation report from 18 months earlier in which Kevin had been given a scenario with no viable solution, a test designed to observe whether junior officers would recognize an unwinnable situation, and Kevin had not recognized it as unwinnable. He had found a solution that the simulation's designers had not anticipated, using a navigational maneuver so counterintuitive that 2 of the observers had initially flagged it as a system error. It wasn't a system error. It was Kevin Park, at age 29, deciding that the scenario wasn't unwinnable, because the scenario designers hadn't considered what he was willing to do. The designers had written in their assessment, "This candidate treats constraints as inputs to the problem rather than limits on the problem. Recommend for advanced command track. Also recommend updating the simulation." Carol had underlined that sentence. She had a file folder of officers who had been assessed with some version of that sentence. She called it, in the privacy of her own thinking, the useful ones. On the council station, a research working group had quietly formed around Lou Brennan's tactical doctrine paragraph. It was composed of researchers from 6 different species, and its mandate was to model the predictive limits of human decision-making under constraint. The working group's first meeting ran for 9 hours and ended with every member agreeing that the modeling problem was significantly harder than they had anticipated. The Dominari researcher on the group, a methodical individual named Aiva, who had been studying human civilization for 20 years, said at the end of the meeting, "We keep trying to predict the boundary of their improvisation, but the boundary is not fixed. It moves in response to the problem. Every time we set a limit, we are setting it on yesterday's version of the problem." The group's human liaison, a young researcher named Petra Cole, who had been seconded from Earth's Council Affairs Office and who had not expected to spend her posting explaining human psychology to 6 alien species, said, "That's a very accurate description. We don't really love fixed limits." AAV said, "How do you train for that?" Petra said, "We kinda just let people try things." AAV was quiet for a moment. Then AAV said, "This is going to take a very long time to model." What nobody in the working group had said yet, and what would take 3 more sessions to surface explicitly, was the thing that the Dominari observer had been sitting with since the night he first watched, the Vega engagement record. It was the thing that Vel had come close to with the question about predictability. It was the thing the Velhari ambassador had been circling in her message home. It was this. The Council had spent 60 years assessing humanity as a variable, a factor to be tracked and understood and eventually incorporated. What the Vega engagement had demonstrated in 4 minutes and 30 seconds was that humanity was not a variable in the Council's equation. It was a new kind of constant, the kind that changed what the equation could do. The Jaqueth had done the math faster than anyone else, which was why they had withdrawn. They had looked at 4 ships against 14 and seen an outcome that should not have been possible. And they had understood, with the clear efficiency of a species that did not waste time on denial, what it meant for every future calculation that included a human fleet. Carol Haynes did not know she had changed anything. She had done what the mission required. She had written a report about it. She had made sure her crew was rested and her ship was repaired, and that Kevin Park had been properly advanced, and that the colonists at Vega Prime had a functioning orbital defense system that was no longer being described as a tin can with attitude. She was sitting in her cabin on the Resolute 3 days after the council briefing, reading the latest communication from Fleet Command when Gary Owens sent her a message. It said, "The Council Working Group on Human Tactical Doctrine has requested access to your after-action reports from the last 6 years. Thought you should know." Carol sent back a message that said, "Fine. Tell them the sandwich footnote is load-bearing. Do not skip it." Gary's reply came back in under a minute. Carol did not reply. She had a briefing to prepare for the next patrol rotation, and 3 of her junior officers had submitted training evaluations that needed her comments before end of week. She put Gary's message in a folder marked later and went back to work. Outside the Resolute's hull, the station's docking bay was quiet. 2 Jaqueth diplomatic couriers had departed in the last 48 hours. A Velhari research vessel had arrived. A Dominari long-range observer ship that had no official business at the station was sitting in an outer berth and, when queried by traffic control, had said only that it was conducting a routine calibration check. It had been conducting this calibration check for 4 days. Nobody on the council had commented on it officially. 3 people had mentioned it in the unofficial channels. One of them was Sora of the Velhari, who had sent a note to the council secretary that said, "The Dominati are watching the human ship." Vel had replied, "Yes." Sora had replied, "This is new behavior." Vel had replied, "Most things involving the humans turn out to be." Carol's lights were on in her cabin, through the narrow port beside her desk, if anyone had been looking, which the Dominari calibration check vessel almost certainly was. You could see the faint blue glow of a working screen and the silhouette of someone who had no idea she was being watched and would not have changed what she was doing if she had known. She was reading a training evaluation. She had a red stylus in her hand. She was making notes in the margin about an ensign who had found an unexpected solution to a constrained scenario and had not yet realized that this was the most important thing she had done in her career so far. Carol was writing in the margin, "Do not let this one go unnoticed." Outside, the station turned slowly in the dark. Somewhere in the council's administrative archive, a 60-year assessment file on humanity had been flagged for comprehensive revision. The researcher assigned to lead the revision had requested a budget extension because she had written in her application, the original assessment had approximately 12 fundamental assumptions that all needed to be re-examined simultaneously, and she wanted to do it right. The budget was approved in under 48 hours. That had never happened before either. And on the Resolute, Carol Haynes finished her last evaluation, turned off her light, and went to sleep, because tomorrow was another day. Another patrol rotation, another set of problems that did not yet know they were about to meet someone who had decided the galaxy had noted humanity for 60 years. Now it was paying attention.